Welcome back, dear listener. Settle in now. Let your body sink into wherever you are resting. Your pillow, cool and soft beneath your head. Your blanket warm and heavy across your shoulders. Take one slow breath in, and let it go. Tonight, we travel somewhere old and wonderful. A place stitched together from the stories your grandparents whispered, from books read by candlelight, from the dream space that lives just beyond the edge of waking. This is a story of a great enchanted forest, a forest that has no name on any map, but which every sleeping heart has visited at least once. It is a place where familiar faces wander paths of silver moss, where the trees hum lullabies in a language older than words, and where every road, no matter how winding, leads home. You have nothing to do tonight but listen. Nothing to worry about, nothing to solve. The world outside this story can wait. We'll all be there in the morning. For now, close your eyes. Let the words carry you. And let yourself drift. There is a forest at the edge of every village, if you know how to look for it. It's not the kind of forest with parking lots and trail markers and little wooden signs pointing toward the picnic area. This forest belongs to a different order of things entirely. It breathes. It watches. It remembers every soul that has ever stepped beneath its canopy, and it keeps their names written in the rings of its oldest trees. On an evening in the long, long ago, which is the only time such things happen properly, a girl with a red hood walked into this forest as the sun was pulling its orange blanket over the hills. Her name, if you were curious, was Clara. But the forest did not care about names. The forest cared about footsteps, and Clara's were light and sure. Sport the footsteps of someone who had been told not to stray from the path so many times that the warning had lost all of its weight. The way a word does when you repeat it too many times in a row. Path, path, path. You see, it stops meaning anything. The basket on her arm was heavy with bread and butter and a little pot of honey, the color of captured sunlight. She had been meant to take it to her grandmother, who lived in a stone cottage on the other side of the wood. She had taken this walk 100 times. She knew where the path bent left around the old lightning-struck oak. She knew where the stream crossed under a bridge of flat, mossy stones. She knew where the blackberry canes reached out from the undergrowth like the fingers of something curious and thorny. But this evening, the forest was different. She noticed it first in the quality of the light. It came down through the canopy in long, slow shafts, the way light moves underwater, gentle, thick, full of floating motes that seemed less like dust and more like small sleeping things drifting on a current. The air smelled of pine and something sweeter beneath it, like warm vanilla, or like a library on a summer afternoon, or like the inside of a cedar chest full of old quilts. Clara slowed her walking. The forest was quieter than usual, and yet not silent. There was a sound beneath the silence, a low, resonant hum, as though the trees themselves were exhaling a single held note. She had never heard it before, and yet she recognized it immediately. The way you recognize a song you must have heard in a dream. She did not mean to leave the path. She simply followed the sound. The ground underfoot changed gradually, so gradually she did not notice until the packed her path had become something else. Entirely, a carpet of silver-green moss that accepted each footfall with a soft yielding, like pressing your palm into fresh bread dough. Her feet, inside their familiar brown boots, felt the difference, but did not object. Her feet, in fact, seemed to be enjoying themselves. The trees grew older as she walked. Their trunks grew wider and more gnarled, wrapped in bark that rippled like slow water. Their roots rose from the ground in great curved arches, creating little alcoves and chambers, dark and inviting. In one such alcove, she was fairly certain she saw a small light winking on and off. Though whether it was a firefly or a lantern or something else entirely, she could not say. She walked for what felt like a very long time, and then she walked for what felt like no time at all, which is the nature of this kind of walking. When the forest has decided to show you something, And then she stopped. Before her, in a small clearing where 3 enormous oaks stood in a triangle as though they had arranged themselves deliberately, was a door. Not a door attached to anything, just a door, standing upright in the moss, framed in carved wood that had weathered to the color of old bone. It was perhaps 6 feet tall, and painted, or had once been painted, a blue that was almost the color of the sky at the exact moment between afternoon and evening. A color that has no proper name in any language, Clara knew. She stood and looked at the door for a long moment. The door stood and looked back, and then, because she was the sort of girl who had always suspected that interesting things lay on the other side of closed doors, Clara reached out and turned the handle. The handle was cold iron, shaped like a sleeping fox, its tail curled over to form the latch. Beneath her fingers, it felt warm, warmer than it should have been, given the iron and the evening air, and she had the distinct impression that the fox's tail twitched slightly as she gripped it. She told herself this was imagination. She was mostly correct. The door swung open without a sound. On the other side was a garden. Not the garden she might have expected. No wild tangle of enchanted roses. No poisoned apples gleaming on trees. No hedge maze trimmed into the shapes of animals. This garden was softer than that. It was the kind of garden that happens when someone has loved a plot of earth for a very long time and then left it to itself. There was structure still, the ghost of old borders and beds, but nature had softened all the edges, filling in the spaces with foxgloves and chamomile and tall grasses that swayed in a breeze Clara could not feel on her own skin. In the center of the garden was a stone bench, and on the stone bench sat a woman. She was old, very old, the kind of old that wraps itself around a person like a landscape, so that she seemed less like someone sitting in a garden and more like something that had grown there, deep-rooted and patient. Her hair was white as winter light. Her hands, folded in her lap, were mapped with veins as fine as the lines on a leaf. Her eyes, when she opened them and looked at Clara, were the color of shallow water over stones, clear and cool, and somehow seeing everything at once. There was a moment between them, one of those quiet moments that contain more than most conversations do, where the old woman's eyes moved over Clara's face the way a practiced reader moves over a well-loved page, unhurried, finding everything in its right place. The old woman's expression settled into something that was not quite a smile, and not quite recognition, and not quite surprise, but held something of all three, the way an old house holds the warmth of the people who have lived in it long after they are gone. She patted the bench beside her with a hand so gentle the motion was barely more than an intention. Clara understood without needing to be told. She sat. She opened her basket and broke the bread and handed half to the old woman. And they sat together on the stone bench in the evening garden and ate without speaking, which was its own form of welcome. Above them, the first stars appeared, one by one in the sky, like ideas occurring slowly to someone very thoughtful. The chamomile around their feet breathed its soft medicinal sweetness into the cooling air. A moth found the lantern light and circled it in slow, patient orbits. The garden held them both in its particular stillness, and neither of them felt any hurry, because a place like this does not recognize hurry as a concept. After a while, Clara let her gaze travel the garden, the foxglove spires going to seed, the long grass silver at the tips, the old stone wall at the far end with its cap of moss like a sleeping animal, and her expression asked a question that she did not put into words. Okay? The old woman followed her gaze and seemed to read the question in it perfectly. She was. The old woman showed Clara through the arrangement of her body in that space, through the way she sat as though she had been sitting there since before the garden's first planting, through the way her hands rested in her lap as though they had completed every task ever asked of them and were now at their own permanent ease. She was someone for whom this garden was not merely a garden, but a kind of answer. This was the place where the old stories came to rest between their tellings, where the characters slept when no one was reading about them, where the magic went when it was not being used. The understanding settled into Clara the way all the best understandings do, not like information arriving from outside, but like something waking up that had always been there. She felt it in her chest, a soft expansion, the way a room feels larger when you light a lamp in it. She looked toward the forest, still visible beyond the blue door that stood open behind her. The distant dark beneath the canopy was full of presences. She sensed not threatening ones, but inhabited ones, other stories, other characters. The forest had the feeling of a library after closing time, when all the readers have gone home and the books are simply themselves again, resting in their particular companionable quiet. The old woman watched Clara's face as Clara looked at the forest, and she seemed satisfied by whatever she found there. She nodded once, very slightly, the nod of someone confirming what they already knew. She gestured toward the edge of the garden where the moonflowers grew, small white blooms with silver-threaded edges, each one opening as the evening deepened, lifting their faces to the darkening sky with the unhurried confidence of things that know their hour. The gesture was not urgent. It was simply an indication. There, that way. Clara looked at her basket again. The bread was still there, and the butter and the honey. But there was something else now, settled in the corner as though it had always been there. A small glass lantern with a flame inside the color of amber, giving off a warmth that reached her fingers through the wicker. She had not put it there. She was not in this forest. Surprised by this, she picked it up, and the warmth of it spread up her arm and into her shoulders, loosening something she had been holding without knowing she held it. She looked at the old woman with eyes full of the particular kind of gratitude that does not know quite how to express itself, and the old woman answered the look with that not quite smile, that expression full of more than it showed. She closed her eyes then, folded her hands, and returned to the comfortable occupation of being very old in a garden in the evening, as the stars above multiplied and the moonflowers at the garden's edge continued, one by one, to open. Clara rose, took her basket, lifted her lantern, and walked into the forest. The trees received her without ceremony, the way the sea receives a swimmer, surrounding her, holding her, changed somehow by her presence and changing her in return. She walked for a while in a direction that felt right without being exactly north or south or any measurable thing. The moonflowers appeared along her path, just as she had somehow understood they would, small white blooms with silver-threaded edges, growing from the bases of trees and from cracks in the mossy ground, each one opening as she approached, as though lifting its face to be seen. Spelled, she found, of rain on warm stone, and of old books, and of something she could not quite name, but which made her feel very calm and very awake at the same time. The forest was full of sound now, the soft trilling of night insects, the occasional distant call of an owl, and beneath it all, that low hum, that resonance, which she now understood was the sound of many old stories resting in the same place, their energies overlapping and combining into something as fundamental as the heartbeat of the earth. She rounded a great curved route and stopped. There was a light ahead of her, not her lantern's amber glow, but something cooler and bluer flickering through the trees, and there was a figure. A young man sitting on a fallen log with his long legs folded awkwardly beneath him. His posture, that of someone engaged in a very sincere internal argument. He did not seem dangerous. He seemed, if anything, thoroughly preoccupied with himself, which, in Clara's experience, was the least dangerous thing a person could be. She moved toward him carefully, quietly, the moss swallowing her footsteps. She came to the edge of the clearing and looked at him properly in the flickering light. He was tall, very tall, in a way that seemed still new to him, the way height is new to someone who has recently grown into it, or grown into himself. His face was young and dark-eyed, and extremely earnest. His nose was remarkable. There was truly no way to see it and not notice it. It was the kind of nose that entered a room slightly before the rest of its owner. Long and fine, and currently, she noticed with interest, somewhat variable in its exact length, depending on moments she could not entirely account for. He became aware of her presence the way people do in still places, not with a startle exactly, with a sudden realignment, the way a compass needle swings when it finds north. He looked at her, and his dark eyes went wide, and then soft, cycling through alarm and embarrassment and something like relief in the span of a second or two. He stood, unfolding his considerable height from the log, and swept a bow that was so earnest and thorough that it was immediately endearing. He straightened and looked at her, and his expression settled into the open, curious, slightly abashed expression of someone who has been caught in the middle of something private, is not entirely sure how to explain it. She sat down on the log beside him, because he seemed like someone who would benefit from company, and because sitting down felt right. For a while, they simply sat together, which was enough. The forest did not require explanation, and neither did they. And the blue light flickered at the edges of the clearing, and the moonflowers glowed at their feet, and the warm amber of her lantern mixed with the cool blue of his into something that was simply light. He was, she gathered from the particular quality of his stillness, someone who had been walking for a long time, not physically tired. The forest did not work in physical tired, exactly, but the kind of tired that comes from being in between things, from being a thing that was made and then changed, and is now still in the process of determining what it has become. He had the look of someone for whom every sensation was still slightly new, slightly present, slightly more than expected. The texture of the log beneath him, the temperature of the air, the particular resistance of moss under his boots. He noticed all of it with a thoroughness that most people long since stopped applying to the furniture of daily existence. He was, in short, a boy who had learned to be real, and was still learning what that meant. His name was Pinocchio, and she knew it the way you know things in forests like this one, not from being told, but from something deeper than telling. From the particular gravity a person carries when they belong to a story old enough to have settled into the bones of the world. The honesty in him was visible, if you knew how to look. It was not a performed honesty, not the ostentatious truthfulness of someone who wants credit for telling the truth. Okay. It was more fundamental than that. It was the honesty of a creature for whom the alternative was, quite literally, written on his face. He could not deceive, and having made peace with this, had discovered that the world was in fact rather more interesting when seen plain. He noticed small things. He noticed them with the whole of himself, unhurried and complete, the way wooden boys have time to notice things while they are learning to be real. She held up the lantern slightly, extending its warm circle outward. The blue light from whatever had been keeping him company in the clearing softened and merged with the amber, and became simply light, whole, and undivided. He watched this happen, and something in his expression settled. The way a surface settles after something disturbs it, returning to a stillness that is deeper than the one before. Together they rose, Clara with her basket and lantern, Pinocchio with nothing but his long legs and his observant eyes, and they followed the moonflowers deeper into the forest. The trees sighed around them as they walked. The stars overhead moved slowly, or perhaps did not move at all, and there was no way to be certain. The night was warm and soft and full of small sounds, and neither of them felt the need to speak very much, which was its own kind of comfort. The forest accepted their silence and gave back its own, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of fullness, of a place so inhabited by its own living that it had no need to fill itself with noise. They walked, and the forest breathed, and somewhere ahead of them, in the silver dark, the next part of the story waited to be found. The moonflowers led them east, or what felt like east, in the way that directions in enchanted forests feel like something without necessarily being anything on a compass. The trees grew taller as Clara and Pinocchio walked, their canopy thickening overhead until only the occasional star was visible, winking through gaps in the branches like eyes opening in the dark. The ground beneath their feet remained soft, the moss springy and pale in the light of Clara's lantern. Pinocchio, she noticed, walked with a particular, careful attention to each footfall, the way someone does when they are still getting used to having feet that feel. She watched him and understood, without needing it explained, that for him the act of walking itself was still somewhat wondrous. The press of the moss, the give of the earth, the particular weight of his own body moving through space, these were not things. He had grown accustomed to the way most people grow accustomed to their own existence until they stop feeling it at all. He felt all of it, all the time, in the buzzing, prickling fullness of someone whose aliveness was still relatively new and had not yet dulled at the edges. Most people, she thought, spent most of their time trying to feel less present. He had the opposite condition, and wore it like a gift he was still learning to carry without spilling. The forest opened before them like a slow exhalation. The clearing they stepped into was wide and hushed, the grass within it perfectly still despite the faint breeze that moved the branches at its edges. At the far end of the clearing, rising from a tangle of briars and roses so thick they had become a wall, was a palace. It was not ruined, exactly, but it was sleeping. That was the only word for it. The stones held the particular stillness of a face in deep, steep rest. The windows dark, but not dead. The towers rising into the night sky with the quiet dignity of something that knows it will still be standing when the current troubles have blown past. Roses climbed every surface, enormous blooms of pink and cream and deep red, their petals heavy and perfect and utterly still in the windless air within the briars. Pinocchio stopped at the edge of the clearing and looked at the palace for a long moment. His expression was the expression of someone who has just encountered proof of something they had only half believed, open and wondering and settling slowly into a new and larger understanding of what the world contained. He had dreamed this, perhaps, in the way wooden boys dream, not in sleep exactly, but in the long, patient hours of watching and being still, when the mind wanders into the shapes of things it has not yet seen. Clara studied the wall of briars. It was dense, genuinely impenetrable, she thought, a living fortress of thorns as long as her finger, woven together in a pattern that looked almost deliberate, almost architectural, almost. Pinocchio moved slightly ahead of her. He was looking at the lower left corner of the briar wall, his dark eyes tracing something she had not yet seen, his head tilted at the particular angle of someone following a line that others have missed. He had that quality, the quality of someone who notices small things, not because he was looking for them, but because looking was simply what his eyes did all the time, without effort or fatigue. There was a gap in the briar wall, not an opening exactly, more like a seam, a place where two sections of the thorn weave had not quite met, barely wide enough for a person to slip through sideways if they were careful, if they were patient, if they did not mind going slowly. Clara went first, holding her lantern ahead of her. The thorns pressed in on either side, close enough to snag her breathing, even as she held her body still and moved with great deliberate care. Her red hood caught once, and she went perfectly motionless, the way you wait when something has hold of you, with the whole body's attention suddenly gathered to one small point until the fabric released, and then she was through, standing in a cobblestoned courtyard, turning to guide the considerable length of her companion's distinctive nose safely through the gap. The courtyard was still. At its center was a fountain water suspended, medark, frozen not by ice but by sleep, hanging in the air in perfect curved forms like glass sculptures. Clara reached out and touched one of the suspended drops with a fingertip. It was cool and wet, entirely water, and it held its shape around her touch as though the world had simply pressed pause on the moment. She held her finger there for a breath, too. The water waited with her. Around the edges of the courtyard, seated on benches and leaning against walls and slumped over window ledges, were people, palace guards in their livery, kitchen maids in their aprons. A man who appeared to be a chancellor, with a scroll still clutched in his sleeping hand. A dog, 2 cats, a small child who had fallen asleep in the act of chasing a butterfly that now hovered motionless an inch above her reaching hand. All of them sleeping. All of them breathing, slowly, with the easy depth of dreamers who are in no hurry whatsoever. There was something deeply peaceful about it. Not the peace of absence, the peace of fullness, of lives that had simply pressed pause and were resting in mid-moment, held perfectly in the amber of enchantment, their faces smooth and their bodies heavy and still in the way of the genuinely, completely, perfectly asleep. Clara and Pinocchio moved through them with care, with the particular reverence of the waking moving among the sleeping, that ancient unspoken obligation of tenderness. They went inside. The great doors were not locked, only closed, and they swung open at a push, letting out a breath of warm air that smelled of roses and beeswax candles and something lavender sweet. Inside, the palace was all shadowed grandeur, long corridors lined with tapestries, suits of armor standing at attention, oil paintings of serious-faced ancestors looking down from great heights. Everything was mid-motion. A suit of armor whose gauntlet had been reaching for a door handle. A cat leaping from a windowsill, suspended in the air. A jester who had been mid-tumble, now frozen in a pose of considerable acrobatic complexity. In a kitchen they passed. A cook's hand was suspended over a pot, a drop of liquid hanging forever from a wooden spoon. In a gallery, a musician's bow was pressed against the strings of a violin, the note it had been drawing caught in the throat of the air itself, all of it waiting, all of it held in that deep, patient, silvered suspension. They made their way up a great staircase, following the moonflowers, whose white petals appeared now as a trail of blossoms somehow pressed between the stones of the steps. Glowing gently upward, the staircase curved as it climbed, and the balustrade was carved with sleeping animals, foxes and deer and small birds with folded wings that seemed, in the lantern light, to breathe very slightly. At the top of the stair, at the end of a long corridor, was a room. Inside the room was a bed. On the bed lay a girl with dark hair spread across the pillow like a fan, her hands folded on her chest, her face so peaceful and perfect in its repose that it took Clara's breath away slightly. She was very beautiful, though that was almost beside the point. It was the quality of the sleeping itself that struck, the absolute completeness of it, the sense that this was someone who had found in sleep something that had eluded her while waking, the sleep of someone who knows all of sleep's paths and has walked them for a very long time and has made of that long walking something almost like wisdom. And by the window, on the narrow outer sill of the room's only window, his legs hanging over what appeared to be a very long drop into the moonlit courtyard below, sat a young man. He had not noticed the mentor, which was remarkable, but then he was very thoroughly occupied with his own thoughts. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his chin in his hands, and his gaze directed not at the view below him, but inward, in the way of someone who has been in the middle of a long, slow, difficult reckoning with himself. He was perhaps 17, with dark, tangled hair and a face that was attractive in the way of someone who has recently been very sad for a long time. His clothes were fine once, now road-worn. He had the posture of someone who had come a very long way and had arrived at the destination only to discover that the destination raised more questions than the journey. He became aware of their presence gradually. First, a sense of something shifting in the room, then a small sound, then the particular prickle of being watched. He turned and looked at them, and his face went through several things in rapid succession before settling on something that was, Clara thought, primarily relief. He looked at the sleeping girl. He looked at Clara and Pinocchio. He looked at his own hands. His expression, turned toward the sleeping girl, was the expression of someone in the middle of making a very difficult decision. Not a dramatic decision, not a heroic one, but a quiet and specifically ethical one. The kind of decision that does not make stories, but makes people. He had been sitting on this windowsill for what his body suggested was a long time, long enough to have thought through the same question from every angle, long enough for the question to have clarified itself from the general shape of what he was supposed to do into the much more particular and personal shape of what was actually right. He was a prince. That much was clear from something in his bearing, not arrogance, but a kind of trained composure underneath the wariness. The composure of someone who has grown up being watched and has learned to carry himself with a certain deliberate care. His name, though he had not said it, felt like Philip. The forest offered names the way it offered moonflowers, quietly, without fanfare, at the moment you needed them. Pinocchio looked at him. His dark eyes moved from the prince to the sleeping girl to the prince again. And in them was the particular clear sight of someone who cannot deceive and therefore finds it difficult to overlook the truth of things. He saw immediately what the prince was grappling with. He could not have named it in words because it was not a verbal understanding. It was the direct perception of someone who has spent a great deal of time learning the difference between what is done and what is right, between the story as written and the story as it ought to go. The prince looked back at Pinocchio and saw that he was seen. Something in him loosened the slight lowering of a weight carried alone for too long, turned back toward the sleeping girl, sat very still for a long moment, and then he drew the chair from beside the bed and sat in it, and he began to talk to her. The palace held the sound of his voice the way old stone holds warmth, absorbing it slowly, keeping it, returning it gently into the room. What he said, no story needs to record. It was the kind of talking that matters only between the person speaking and the person sleeping or waking, receiving it. It was quiet and unhurried and completely honest, which is the only voice that reaches sleeping people who are too deep in their own interior country to hear anything less than the truth. He talked for a long time. Clara sat in the room's other chair, and Pinocchio settled on the floor near the door with his long legs folded beneath him. And the lantern burned between them, and outside the stars moved in their slow, deliberate way. And the palace slept, and the breathing of the girl on the bed was as slow and soft as the sound of the sea when you are not trying to hear it, only when you stop trying. And then, in the space between one breath and the next, between one tick of the stopped palace clock and its phantom successor, the sleeping girl's eyelashes fluttered, not all at once, slowly, the way someone surfaces from deep water. First, a sense of movement, then a ripple, then a hand breaking the surface, then a face, then the whole luminous surfacing. She opened her eyes. They were the color of deep forest, dark green and brown and gold, all mixed together. They focused first on the ceiling, then on the window, then on the chair beside the bed, and on the young man sitting in it with his travel-worn clothes and his dark, tangled hair, and his expression of someone who has just arrived, finally, at the end of a very long sentence. The moment between them was not dramatic. It was quiet, as the most important moments tend to be. She looked at him, and he looked at her. And 100 years of sleeping and 100 years of waiting, which are not so different as they might seem, met in the center of that quiet room and recognized each other. She sat up slowly, looking around with a particular wonder of someone returning to a landscape they left behind a very long time ago. She took in the familiar shapes, the ceiling, the window, the carved posts of the bed, the tapestry on the wall with its hunting scene, frozen mid-chase, and the unfamiliar ones, Clara with her red hood and her basket, Pinocchio, improbably long-nosed and looking at everything with his usual, complete, uncomplicated attention. The amber lantern. She took it all in with the unhurried calm of someone who has spent a century in her own interior country and emerged from it knowing exactly who she is. The sleep had not diminished her. Anything, it had concentrated her, the way a long winter concentrates a tree, driving everything down into the roots, making the spring arrival something of consequence. Her name was Aurora, and she was awake, and around the palace the world was beginning to wake with her. Outside, in the courtyard, the frozen fountain sputtered and then ran. The sleeping servants stirred. The cats, mid-leap, landed with the surprised competence of creatures who have landed on their feet in much more demanding circumstances. The child caught the butterfly and then opened her hands and let it go, watching it spiral upward into the night sky with the dreaming inattention of the very young. The palace was waking around them, slowly and warmly, as their small company passed through the great doors and out into the briar-walled courtyard. In the moonflowers, Clara saw, had reappeared along the base of the briar wall and where they grew. The thorns had softened and parted, opening a wide, easy path back into the forest. They went through it together, for now, instead of two, with the amber lantern swinging and the night breathing around them, Kay and Philip walking alongside Aurora with the air of someone who has recently made up his mind about something and discovered that having made it up, everything feels lighter. She walked with the particular alert wonder of someone who has been given back their own life and is finding all its edges fresh. She noticed everything: the moonflowers, the moss, the temperature of the air, the way the lantern threw their shadows, long and slow across the ground, with a hunger that was not desperate but joyful, the hunger of a person who knows what it is to be deprived of sensation and has decided never again to take any of it for granted. They went together into the good dark of the enchanted forest, whatever came next waiting with patient, luminous attention. The forest changed again. This is the nature of the enchanted forest. It is not one place, but many, folded together like the pages of a very long book. And as you walk through it, you turn from one chapter to the next without always noticing the transition. Clara noticed, though, because she had been paying attention to the moonflowers, and the moonflowers had shifted their color slightly, still silver at the edges, but with a new warmth in their centers, a deep gold amber that matched the light of the lantern she carried. Aurora walked beside her. The princess had proven, in the time since they had left the sleeping palace, to be an exceptionally good walker, unhurried and observant, the patience of someone who has nothing to prove to anyone about pace. She moved through the forest with a kind of reverent attention, her eyes moving constantly, touching every surface. She touched tree bark when she passed close enough to reach it. She crouched briefly over a moonflower and studied it with complete absorption before rising and moving on. She tilted her head back to look at stars through the canopy gaps, standing perfectly still in those moments, her expression one of pure, uncomplicated receiving. 100 years of knowing exactly what was going to happen was very pleasant, her bearing said, not to know, to be in motion towards something unnamed. Behind them, Pinocchio and Philip had found each other's company in the organic way of people who share an interest without knowing they share it until one of them mentions it. And the other's eyes light up in a particular way that says, "Oh, you too." Pinocchio had been built, every joint of him, every carved length, fitted and lathed and assembled by loving hands, and the making of things lived in him as a felt knowledge rather than an intellectual one. Philip had grown up in a kingdom where the maintenance of things was the daily fabric of governance, and had spent years thinking about how structures held, how walls were repaired, how the fit of stone to stone determined whether a building lasted 10 years or 10 centuries. They fell into their discussion with the absorbed earnestness of two people who have simultaneously discovered that someone else finds genuinely interesting what the rest of the world considers insufferably dull. Their voices behind her were a low, comfortable counterpoint to the forest's own sounds, the insects, the owl, the hum of the old trees, and Clara listened to them without listening. It's the way you listen to a stream while reading, taking comfort from the sound without attending to its content. The trees around them had been growing steadily different, taller, more formal, their trunks as straight and wide as the pillars of a great hall. Between them, the ground was carpeted, not with moss, but with fallen leaves, the color of old pages. and they made a soft, papery sound underfoot. A sound that was somehow both quiet and full of information, the way an unopened letter is. The smell had changed too. The green wildness had given way to something warmer and drier, beeswax and leather, and the particular sweetness of old paper. A smell that Clara associated so strongly with libraries that she half expected to find shelves between the trees. She did, as it happened, find shelves between the trees. Not shelves in the usual sense, not built things of pine or oak, screwed together and painted. These were more like the trees themselves had reached their enormous roots up and formed shelves. Their bark, worn smooth, where the weight of books had rested there for what appeared to have been a very long time. And on the shelves were books, hundreds of them, thousands perhaps. Books in every size and color, their spines facing outward. Their titles pressed in gold and silver, and in languages Clara could not read, in a few she could. She stopped walking without being entirely aware she had stopped, and stood and looked at the shelves of the forest library with the particular reverence of someone who has always believed that books are a form of shelter. She breathed it in the deep, warm complexity of that smell, the beeswax and leather and old pages. The smell of 1,000 stories resting between their covers in the cool forest air. She felt, in that first moment, the specific comfort of the avid reader in the presence of many books, the comfort that has nothing to do with reading any particular book and everything to do with knowing they are there, that they can be reached, that their worlds are available and patient and waiting. Behind her, the others had stopped too. Aurora's hand had gone to the spine of the nearest book and rested there very lightly. Her fingers curved around its worn cloth as though around something alive. Pinocchio was looking at the shelves with the systematic attention of someone inventorying the visible universe. Even Philip had stopped mid-stride, looking at the shelves with the odd expression of someone from whom many things have been withheld, reading being perhaps among them. A figure appeared from between two great oaks. He was large, very large, not threatening in size, but simply substantial, the way mountains are substantial, something that has been exactly itself for so long that the shape of it is inarguable. He had the head of a beast and the bearing of a scholar, and a blue coat that was rather fine and somewhat worn at the elbows, which Clara thought was exactly correct for someone who spent a great deal of time reading. In his enormous hand, he carried a book open, his page held with a thumb the size of Clara's fist. He stopped when he saw them. The tea stopped too. The stopping was mutual and lasted several seconds, and during those seconds a number of things were communicated without being said. He had prepared himself in the way of those who live alone for the possibility of intrusion. There was a faint bracing in his massive shoulders, a subtle readiness in his posture that was not aggression, but the deep, animal preparedness of something that has been startled before and learned to expect startling. And then, as the moment stretched, and no one screamed, and no one stepped backward, and Clara held her lantern a little higher so that more of his face was visible in its warm light, the preparedness began to settle. Pinocchio was already looking at the shelves with the entirely unself-conscious, conscious interest of someone to whom the enormous beast-headed figure holding a book is simply one of many interesting things in the vicinity, and perhaps not even the most interesting. This, more than anything, seemed to soften something in the beast's expression. He was not accustomed to being seen in a room and not being the primary thing that was seen. Clara looked at him with a steadiness that was not bravery exactly. She was a girl who followed sounds into forests, who opened doors without knowing what was behind them, and she had arrived at a library in the middle of an enchanted forest at some hour between midnight and dawn. Steadiness was what the situation seemed to call for. The beast looked back at her with eyes that were very human, very dark, and very tired in the way of someone who has been left with their own company for longer than was perhaps ideal, and in whose company were the best books in the world, and who had read them all, and who was perhaps ready, though they did not yet know it, for a reader to arrive. He went back between the shelves and returned with the book, small, slim, bound in dark green cloth, with no title on the spine. He held it out to Clara with the hesitant certainty of someone who does not know exactly why they are doing a thing, but knows that the thing is right. His hand was enormous around it. She was very small beside him. She took it. It was warm. She put it in her basket and felt the basket become slightly heavier and simultaneously lighter, which is the quality of things that belong to you arriving in your hands. Aurora had moved along the shelves, her fingers trailing from spine to spine in a slow, exploratory way, tilting her head to read titles in the languages she knew and studying the shapes of the letters in the ones she did not. She turned, at some point, and looked at the beast directly, with that particular, clear, and unsentimental curiosity she had brought to everything since waking. The curiosity of someone who has been asleep for 100 years and has decided that nothing in the world deserves to go unexamined. He met her gaze with the wariness of someone not used to being regarded as simply interesting. She regarded him as simply interesting. The wariness under sustained application of this treatment began very slowly to give way. Pinocchio had found, on one of the shelves, a book whose spine he was tracing with one long finger, his face wearing the absorbed expression of someone encountering a mirror, not the actual Pinocchio, not his own story exactly, but something that touched the edge of it, some cousin story, some tale that circled the same questions from a different direction. He took it from the shelf carefully and turned it in his hands and opened it to the middle and read a paragraph, and his expression was one of the deepest attentiveness. And then he closed it and held it and looked at the beast who had been watching him, and a small nod passed between them that was complete in itself. The beast looked at his shelves, his long-companioned forest library, the books resting in their places as they always did. He looked at the small lantern in Clara's hand, and the silver-edged moonflowers at her feet, and the little company of 4 who had appeared in his forest library at whatever hour this was, and who were now settled among his shelves like people who had always known libraries were a form of shelter, and had simply been waiting for the right one to appear. He set his book down on a root, very carefully, the way he set all books down. He straightened his worn blue coat, and then he walked to the edge of the group, just outside the pool of lantern light, stood there, not excluded, but choosing his position with the instinctive care of something that did not yet quite believe it was welcome. Clara moved the lantern slightly, extending the circle of its light to include him. She did not make a thing of it. She simply moved the lantern and pretended not to notice when he moved slightly into the warmth. And so there were 5 of them now. Key walked with them, this library-keeping beast, Kay, and he knew the forest in a different way than the moonflowers knew it. Not directing, Kay, but contextualizing, offering small pieces of information as they walked. The name of a tree, the age of a particular formation of stones, the story of a stream they crossed on a bridge of knotted roots. He paused at it and placed his enormous hand flat on the bark of the bridge's central root, and they understood from the quality of his attention that this stream had a history, that it connected to something further back in the forest, that the water that ran beneath them had run, once, into the fountain in a sleeping palace, when the forest was whole and the stories had not yet diverged. Before the curse, it was the same stream. The forest kept it connected. They walked through the forest library as it extended around them, and with each step, the smell of old paper and beeswax receded, and the deeper forest smell, the green and pine and earth and moonflower returned, and the shelves thinned and became roots again, and the books went back into memory and into the long safekeeping of a place where stories rest. The moonflowers brightened ahead of them. The trees grew older. They were getting close to the center. The forest deepens around you. The trees are enormous and ancient. The air is very still. There is nothing you need to do. Just walk with them and breathe and let the story carry you forward through the beautiful dark. The center of the enchanted forest announced itself the way important places do, not with signs or fanfare, but with a quality of attention. A feeling of becoming suddenly more visible to something large and patient and interested in you specifically. The trees at the center were the oldest things Clara had ever seen. Their trunks were wider than houses, their barks silver gray and carved by time into landscapes, ridges and valleys and canyons and caverns. Miniature worlds within worlds. Their roots had long ago made peace with the ground and had stopped pretending to go under it, spreading instead across the surface in great smooth waves, forming natural seats and platforms and bridges between the giants. The canopy above was so dense that no sky was visible, only the occasional star seen through a gap, impossibly distant and impossibly bright. But there was light here, sourceless and warm, silver gold, rising from the moss and from the moonflowers, which grew in great profusion at the bases of the ancient trees. A white and silver carpet of open blooms spreading in every direction. They stopped at the edge of this innermost place and simply breathed it in. The air here was different, not thinner, denser, if anything, denser, with something that had no name in any science, but which the body recognized, the accumulated warmth of 10,000 tellings. It's the concentrated distillation of every time a story had been told with real feeling by a real voice to a real ear. It was the air of a place that has been loved for a very long time, and it entered the lungs like something nourishing. In the center of the center, on the largest root of the largest tree, which was so enormous it seemed less like a tree than like a fact, like a piece of the earth's architecture that had merely chosen a living form, sat an old woman, not the same old woman as the garden. This one was different, smaller and sharper, with quick dark eyes and hands that were never still. She sat very upright, her back straight as a young woman's, her feet flat on the root, her fingers moving in the particular practiced way of someone who has been doing the same task for so long that the task and the person had become indistinguishable. She did not look up immediately when they arrived. She finished whatever stitch her hands were making, or whatever length of thread her fingers were drawing out. The movement was too fine to follow exactly, and then she looked up, and her expression was not surprise. It was satisfaction. The deep, quiet, unhurried satisfaction of someone who has waited a long time for a thing they always knew would come, and who finds, on its arrival, that it is exactly as they had expected. She patted the roots around her, this one and that one, and here and there, and they understood without needing to be told. They sat on roots and moss, arranged in a loose half-circle before her, the lantern set at the center of their group, its amber light mixing with the silver of the moonflowers into something warm and complete. The beast settled slightly apart, as he had taken to doing, not apart enough to be absent, but enough to feel the edges of his own welcome, without yet fully committing to the center of it. Clara looked at the old woman's hands. They were spinning, she realized, spinning something from the air itself. Thin, luminous threads appearing between her fingers as they moved, winding onto a spindle made of dark wood. The threads were the color of the light in the clearing, warm silver or cool gold, or something between the two that shifted depending on the angle of the light and the moment of looking. Each thread, as it left her fingers, seemed to hold something, not weight exactly, but substance, significance, the quality of something that matters without knowing why it matters. The old woman's gaze moved through the group, settling on each face in turn with the comprehensive attention of someone reading a long, complex, beloved text. It was not scrutiny, exactly. It was more like recognition. The recognition of someone who already knows the story and is checking the characters against their inner picture, finding each one correct. She found Philip. Her gaze rested on him for a breath longer than it rested on the others. And in that breath, something moved across his face. Not discomfort exactly, but the expression of someone who has been seen past the surface of themselves into the place where a question lives, that they have not yet answered aloud. He sat very still, his hands on his knees, and looked back at the old woman with a particular courage of someone who has decided to stop avoiding a thing. And then something shifted in him. It happened the way the deepest things happen, not with drama, okay, but with the quality of a river finding a new course, settling into something more natural than what had been before. The question he had been carrying, whether he was the hero because he did heroic things, or whether he was something more essential than that, something that existed in the unobserved interior of him, something that was not performed but simply was, that question in the quality of his stillness before this old woman's steady gaze found its answer. Not from outside, from him. It had been there the whole time. His shoulders dropped slightly, his chin lifted. He looked like someone who has put down a heavy thing they had forgotten they were carrying. The old woman looked at Clara next. Clara looked back, and the look that passed between them was a long one. The old woman's spinning hands did not still. They never stilled, but her attention was entirely present, entirely here. She looked at Clara the way you look at a story that has surprised you by being better than you expected. There was in her gaze a recognition of the particular rarity of someone who hears a humming in the forest and chooses to follow it, who pushes open a door without knowing what is on the other side, who moves through the world not by the path laid out for her, but by the sound of something she cannot yet name. Clara felt, under that gaze, a particular sensation of being known, not known as in surveilled, not known as in explained, but known as in understood, as in seen in the place below, the place where performance lives, in the deeper room where the actual person sits and breathes. She felt the old woman's gaze find the lantern in her basket and rest on it. And in that looking, she understood something about herself that had not been in words before, that the light was hers, that she had not been given it, okay, that she had brought it with her from the very beginning, from before the forest and before the door, from before this particular evening, that the light had always been in her, and the lantern was only its form. The beast moved, slightly, at the edge of the circle. He reached into Clara's basket with an enormous, careful hand, with the practiced gentleness of someone who has spent decades, handling things smaller and more delicate than himself, and withdrew the green book. He looked at it. He turned it over. He opened it. The pages were blank. He had known this in some way he could not have explained since the moment he put it in her basket in the library. He had had it on his shelves for longer than he could account for, had found it there when he first arrived, had run a thumb across its spine 100 times, and always felt the small pull of something not yet said, something held in reserve. He had thought it was one of his. He had kept it, as you keep things that you know belong somewhere without knowing where. He handed it back to Clara, and she opened it, and the pages were still blank, and she understood it was not a story already told. It was a story being told right now, in this forest, in this night, in the walking and the finding and the sitting on this root in this clearing with these people. Every step since the door, the color of the evening sky, had been a word. Every companion, a chapter. Every moment of choosing to follow the sound, to sit beside the boy with a remarkable nose, to take the warmth of the lantern in both hands, had been a sentence in a story that was still in the process of being lived, which is the only way certain stories can be written. She held the book in her lap and felt, in its blank pages, the specific creative way to potential, heavier than words, more spacious than blank space, the holding open of a thing that has not yet happened, but will. Pinocchio, from his place on the moss, had been watching all of this with his usual complete attention. He had been quiet for a long time, which was unusual for someone whose inner life was so thoroughly visible. The quietness had a quality of depth to it, of thinking that had gone past its first layer, and its second was now moving through the bedrock material beneath. He looked at the old woman. She looked back at him, and her expression was the expression of someone who has been expecting a question of this particular weight and has long since prepared the answer. The question in his eyes was the same one he had been carrying since before the forest, since before the transformation, since the first moment of his becoming real. The question of what real meant, whether it applied to him, and whether a character in a story was a kind of real or a kind of metaphor or some third thing that didn't yet have a name. The old woman set her spindle down. She looked at him with complete seriousness, the serious attention reserved for questions that have taken a great deal of courage to ask, even silently. She seemed to consider him, his dark eyes, his extraordinary nose, his long, earnest hands resting on his folded knees, the quality of his attention, the way he held still, even when sitting without growing restless or inward, the way he had looked at every person in their company and found in each of them something worth noticing. And then she returned to her spinning, and the thread wound on, and the moonflowers around them pulsed once, very gently, as if breathing. And Pinocchio's expression, watching the thread, the warm silver thread that was made of telling, of listening, the accumulated warmth of 10,000 genuine encounters between the story and its receiver, settled into something that was not certainty exactly, but was larger than certainty. Was the thing certainty is a small version of. He looked, for a moment, like someone who has finally arrived at the answer to the longest equation of their life, and found it is simply the number 1. The clearing was very quiet. The beast reached into Clara's basket one more time, retrieved the green book, and looked at its blank pages for a long moment before handing it back. His gesture, this time, was more than returning a borrowed thing. It was the gesture of someone consigning something into the right keeping. It's the gesture of an archivist who has been holding a manuscript in trust and can now deliver it to its author. He looked at Clara, and the look contained something that would take him time to name. He would be back at his shelves when he named it, running his finger along a spine and stopping, realizing that was affection, and which was nonetheless completely present in him, whether named or not. The old woman took up her spindle again, and the thread wound on, warm and silver, full of light. They left the center together, and the forest opened before them in the soft way of things that had done what they meant to do and are now ready to let you pass. The old woman did not come with them. She remained on her route, her spindle turning, her fingers moving in their ancient, patient rhythm. As they walked away through the moonflowers and the ancient trees, Clara looked back once and saw her still there, small and upright and entirely sufficient unto herself, and felt a feeling she could not quite name, which was perhaps something between gratitude and recognition. The feeling of having been seen all the way through, and having survived it, and found it to be a gift. Aurora walked beside her, and the two of them moved in a companionable quiet that had the quality of things that don't need to be spoken to be understood. Aurora was thinking about someone. Clara could see it in the particular quality of her gaze. It's directed inward rather than outward, for once, touching something old and complicated and arriving slowly at a resolution. She was thinking about the fairy who had been there at the very beginning, before the curse, before the sleep, the one who was also somehow this old woman, or a version of her, or something that existed in the same order of being. She was thinking about the story as it had unfolded, the long, unfair arc of it, the 100 years of loss, and she was finding in the way you find things when you have had time enough to look properly that it had brought her here, that here was not nothing, that here was, in fact, exactly the right place. She glanced sideways at Philip, who was walking ahead of her, talking with the beast about bread. Of all things the beast had, it emerged, opinions about bread that were both specific and deeply felt. Having had very little access to good bread for a number of years, and having spent some of that time thinking about what he had been missing, the conversation had moved from bread to grain to soil to the specific mineral composition of certain kinds of forest earth, which was not where it had begun, but was, apparently, where it needed to go. Aurora watched Philip talk, and there was in her watching the particular quality of someone who has just discovered a fact about the world that reorganizes the landscape of everything around it. She had known, from the moment he sat in the chair beside her bed and began to talk, that this was someone whose first instinct was honesty, not performed honesty. Not the honesty that announces itself, so quiet, sometimes inconvenient, often slightly embarrassing honesty of someone who cannot quite manage to be otherwise. It was, she thought, the rarest quality. She thought of 100 years of sleeping, and how, in all of sleep's long country, there is no performance at all, just the self, moving through its own interior spaces, without audience. She thought she would recognize sincere honesty when she met it in the waking world. And she had. The forest around them was lighter now, not brighter, exactly, but more spacious, the trees giving way occasionally to wider clearings where the stars were fully visible and the air moved freely, carrying with it the particular coolness of open sky. The moonflowers still led them, their silver edges catching the starlight, their amber centers matching the lantern's glow. Pinocchio walked at Clara's other side, and he too was quiet, which meant his thoughts were deep. He was the kind of person whose silence was proportional to the depth of what was happening below it. He was thinking about the thread the old woman spun, and about the blank pages of the green book, and about the specific sensation of sitting in that clearing, knowing himself to be both a character in a story and a living thing, not one or the other, but genuinely both, without contradiction. The two things had come to rest in him, side by side, not in tension, but in the settled peace of things that have found their right arrangement. He had understood the kind of real that illuminates, the kind that shows people what they could be. This was not a lesser kind of real than the kind that simply is. It was, if anything, a more purposeful kind, carried within him, in his honesty, in his careful noticing, in the long, slow ache of the love he bore for his father, in the complete, earnest openness of his attention to the world, something that people needed to see. Not because it was exceptional, because it was possible. It's because it showed that it could be done, to be made of impermanent things and still become something enduring. He was still between stories, and he found, as the center of the forest receded behind them, and the cooler air of the forest's outer reaches returned, that he did not mind. Between stories was not nothing. Between stories was precisely where the forest lived, and it suited him. The paper-leaf carpet gave way to soft earth, and then to sand that was pale and cool and slightly damp. The smell of water arrived, clean and cold and wide, the smell of a river in the night, a smell that is partly sound and partly temperature and partly the specific freshness of a large body of moving water carrying the cold of its upstream origins into the warm dark. They came to the river at the forest's edge, just as the sky above it was beginning to show the first pale suggestion, not quite color, not quite light, but the possibility of both of the coming dawn. The river was wide and slow and dark in the pre-dawn light, moving with a deep, quiet confidence of something that is always known where it is going. On its far bank, barely visible, Clara could see the shapes of ordinary things, a road, a fence, the distant silhouette of rooftops against a slightly paler sky, the world beyond the forest. She stood at the edge and looked at the far bank, and the feeling she had was complex and layered. The way the feeling at the end of a very good book is layered, reluctance and readiness simultaneously, The awareness of an ending that is also something else, The knowledge that the story has been real and will remain real even after the last page, even in the ordinary world, even in the kitchen with the chamomile tea and the morning light through the window. Pinocchio stood beside her and looked at the river for a long time. The current carried small lights on it, reflections of stars or phosphorescence, something specific to this river, in this forest, at this particular and liminal hour. He watched them travel, each one appearing at the edge of the visible and disappearing into the dark downstream, patient as breath. He turned and looked at the forest behind him. He looked at the trees, the enormous, ancient, silver-gray trunks of the innermost circle, visible still as a wall of darkness further back, and a closer, younger, merely very old trees of the outer regions, and the moonflowers at their bases, and the moss, and the particular quality of the light in that direction. Warm, amber, interior, held. He turned back toward the river and toward the far bank, and the expression on his face was settled. He was not going across. He was going to keep walking along the river, deeper into the parts of the forest he had not yet seen. He was between stories, and he had made his peace with it, and the forest was his for now, and his library was the greatest library in the world, and he had a great deal of noticing still to do. He looked at Clara. She looked at him. Between them passed the particular communication of people who have walked through something together. It's a knowledge of each other that does not require speech and does not diminish with distance. The kind of knowing that belongs to the person, not to the proximity. She held up the green book slightly, and he nodded once, and that was enough. The beast, too, had stopped. He stood at the edge of the forest path, looking at the river, and then looking back over his shoulder, into the trees, into the library, which was somewhere behind him in the warm dark. His shelves, and his books, and his long, contented, solitary stewardship of forgotten stories. He had come further tonight than he had gone in a long time. He had walked out of his library and into the company of people who had found in his shelves the same shelter he'd found in them, and who had moved on and taken a little of him with them, and who had given him, though he would take a long time to name it, the specific warmth of being known as the person you are rather than the appearance you present. He looked at each of them in turn, and his expression, which was usually too much in the vicinity of his face to read easily, was in this moment entirely legible. It was the expression of someone who has been alone for a very long time and has discovered, what to their surprise, that the opposite of alone is not noise or crowding or the loss of self, but simply this: a small group of people in a forest, at the edge of a river, in the hour before dawn, who have been somewhere true together. He would stay. He had always known he would stay. The library needed him, and he needed it. And the forest kept the books, and he kept the forest, and it was a good arrangement, and he was, in the way of people who have found their right place, profoundly and quietly content. But the contentment had, tonight, a new warmth in it. It was the contentment of someone who has been visited, who has been seen, who has had company and shared the warmth of a lantern, and now watches the company move on, carrying a little of that warmth with them outward into the world. Philip had found a boat. This was the kind of thing that happened in enchanted forests. You needed a thing, and the thing was there. The boat was small and wooden and sat patiently at the river's edge, its rope tied to a root, a pair of oars laid inside it. It had the look of something that had been waiting there for exactly this, not a long waiting, not an impatient one, but the settled waiting of an object with a clear purpose that has not yet been fulfilled. The goodbyes at the river's edge were the kind that do not feel entirely like endings, which is the best kind. Pinocchio bowed, his long nose sweeping down and up with enormous gravity. And when he straightened, there was in his dark eyes the full warmth of someone who has been genuinely glad of a companionship and knows it, and is not shy about being known to know it. The beast stood very still and did not touch anyone, but the quality of his stillness was the quality of someone who is doing everything they can to hold a moment in its full weight, to be entirely present for an ending so that its truth is not lost. Clara got into the boat last. C sat in the bow, and Philip took the oars, and Aurora sat in the stern, and they pushed off from the root and into the river. The water accepted them with its usual indifference, not cold, not warm, simply present, simply water, carrying them as it carried everything that found itself in its current. The oars dipped and rose in a slow, steady rhythm. The lanterns settled in the bottom of the boat, through its amber circle, upward into the fog of their breath and the cool, pre-dawn air. On the bank, Pinocchio raised a hand and held it there, patient, unhurried, the gesture of someone who knows that what matters is not the waving, but the having been here. The beast stood beside him, large and still, and watched them go with those very human, very dark eyes, and the forest received them both as the boat drew away from the bank, closing gently around them like a warm and well-read book. Clara looked back once. The forest was a great dark wall of trees behind them, the moonflowers invisible from this distance but present in memory, in the warmth of the lantern still glowing in her basket, in the green book with its still blank pages, in the feeling that had settled into her chest somewhere between the garden and the center and the river, the feeling of having been somewhere that mattered, of having been with people who mattered, of having carried her own light into a dark place and found it sufficient. The boat moved silently across the river. The stars above them were beginning to fade, very gently at the eastern edge. The far bank, the road, waited. The far bank arrived quietly, the way things do when you have stopped expecting them and simply let yourself be carried. Philip drew the oars in, and the boat's flat bottom scraped softly against the sandy shore. And then they were still, and the river moved past them with its deep, self-possessed confidence, and above them the sky was now unmistakably lighter, a pale blue-gray suffusing the horizon, the dark of night retreating westward toward the forest they had left. Her boots sank slightly in the riverbank sand and then found solid ground, the familiar weight of earth beneath her feet. She stood and breathed. The morning air on this side of the river was different from the forest, cooler, sharper, the smell of damp grass and distant wood smoke, and the earthy certainty of a world that runs on schedules and seasons. An ordinary world. The difference between the forest and this world was not the difference between magic and its absence. Philip steadied the boat against the current, while Aurora stepped onto the sand. She looked at the far bank, the forest side, for a long moment before turning to look at the road. Something moved across her face in that looking. Not grief exactly, not longing. More like the feeling of putting down something precious that you were always meant to put down, and finding that your hands, freed, are warm. She turned toward the road, and her expression was settled and forward-looking. Kay and Philip fell into step beside her with the natural ease of people who have arranged themselves without discussing it into a new pattern that fits. They walked together toward the village. The village revealed itself gradually in the gathering light, the way villages do when you approach them from a direction you don't usually take, so that the familiar shapes arrange themselves in an unfamiliar order, and you have to work out the long, low profile of an inn, smoke beginning from its chimney, houses with gardens, the gardens still dark, but beginning to stir with the movement of things that wake at dawn, birds and cats, and a dog sleeping on a doorstep who opened one eye as they passed and then closed it again, reassured by whatever sleeping dogs use to assess the harmlessness of passers-by. The butter, still cool, the honey, its pots sealed tight, the color of captured sunlight visible through the glass. The lantern, its flame now very small but steady, giving off its amber warmth in the growing morning light with the determination of something that has committed to its task and sees no reason to stop, simply because the sun is coming up. The green book. She thought about her grandmother's cottage, which she was fairly certain was at the far end of the village, through the garden gate and up the flagstone path to the red door with the brass knocker shaped like a hair. She thought about the smell of chamomile tea and the sound of the kettle and the particular quality of her grandmother's silence, which was not empty but full of years and warmth and the deep satisfaction of someone who has lived fully and without much apology, who has been to a great many places and returned from all of them carrying something useful, and who is in her stone cottage at the end of the lane, exactly where she has always intended to be, in the center of the village, where the road divided. A moment arrived. One branch headed north toward something larger, and the other curved east toward the open country and the lane and the red door. The three of them stood at the fork, and the morning light was on all their faces. Aurora and Philip looked at each other, and the look that passed between them was the look of a conversation already substantially completed in some interior space a conversation that had taken place not in words, but in the accumulated understanding of people who have been through something real together, and who have arrived through that reality at an arrangement that suits them. They would go north and together, and with the quiet ease of a decision that has been made in the way of all the best decisions. Not dramatically, not after great deliberation, but simply and certainly the way you know where home is when you arrive in its vicinity. They embraced all three of them in the manner of people who do not have the words yet for what they have shared and do not need to, because the thing itself, the forest, the moonflowers, the sleeping palace, the library, the center, the river, was the word for it, and it would stay with them regardless of what they called it. Rora held Clara's hands for a long moment and looked at her. What passed between their eyes was the specific recognition of two people who have both been carrying things for a long time and have both, in the course of one long night, begun to understand the difference between the things that belong to them and the things that are simply in their hands by force of habit. And then they parted, as people do, with the particular lightness of having been somewhere true together. Clara walked east through the village as the sun climbed above the horizon in earnest, turning the world from blue-gray to gold, to sparkled on the garden walls, each drop catching the new light and holding it for a moment before releasing it in a tiny brightening. Roosters announced the morning with their usual lack of subtlety. A woman throwing open her shutters noticed Clara on the road below and lifted a hand in greeting, and Clara lifted one back, and neither of them commented on the basket with the small glowing lantern in it, which was a form of tact available only to people who have seen a great deal of the world and stopped being surprised by its contents. The road was good under her feet, and the morning was good around her shoulders, and Clara felt in her chest the particular fullness that comes after an experience that cannot quite be explained, but does not need to be. The feeling of a dream that leaves behind not images, but warmth. The feeling of having been somewhere important and having brought something of it back with her. Not in her hands, but in the quality of her breath, in the way her feet met the road, in the new and specific understanding of what the lantern meant. She thought about Pinocchio, walking along the river in the forest, noticing small things with his dark, earnest eyes. She thought about him finding, on some shelf between the great roots, a book that asked the right question and allowed him to discover that he already held the answer. She thought about the particular pleasure of someone whose honesty is no longer a burden, but simply a fact, as fundamental and as comfortable as the length of his own remarkable nose. She thought about the beast in his library, enormous and careful, turning pages with hands that were learning to be gentle. She thought about him settling back into the long, companionable quiet of his shelves, and how that quiet would be subtly different now, not lonely in the way it had perhaps sometimes been, but inhabited in a new way, by the memory of amber lantern light and moonflowers and the sound of several people breathing in the same clearing. She thought about the old woman at the center of things, her spindle, turning the thread warm and silver between her fingers. The thread wound on. It always wound on. Even now, even as Clara walked through this ordinary morning in this ordinary village, the thread wound on, adding this, the dew on the garden walls, the roosters, the woman at the window, the basket with its bread and butter and honey and green book and small extinguishing lantern, to the long, luminous record of things that had happened and would rest, eventually, in the rings of the oldest trees. She opened a green book as she walked. The pages were no longer entirely blank. There was writing in them now, not a great deal of it, just a few sentences, set near the top of the first page, in a handwriting she didn't recognize, but felt immediately like her own. It's the kind of handwriting you would have if you wrote by instinct rather than by education, if the hand moved to make the letter before the mind decided on its shape. The sentences said, "The forest is always there. The door, the color of the evening sky, is always in the wood. You only need to know that the humming you hear is someone waiting for you, and that you are allowed to follow it." She closed the book gently and held it against her chest for a moment. Her palm flat against the dark green cover, feeling the warmth of it against her sternum. Then she put it back in the basket with the bread and the butter and the honey. The lantern dimmed and went out very peacefully as the sun rose fully above the roofline. It went out the way a candle goes out at the end of an evening when the last person finally goes to bed, not dramatically, not with effort, but with the small, satisfied gesture of something that has done exactly what it came to do. The morning took over the light without ceremony. The transition was handled with mutual respect. Her grandmother's garden gate was exactly where she had expected it to be. At the end of a short lane, red paint slightly peeling, and the latch the same cold iron she had always known, warmed now by the morning sun to something between cool and comfortable. She pushed it open and went up the flagstone path, past the rosemary hedge with its gray-green fronds, still holding the night's dew, past the lavender bed where the first bees of the morning were just arriving to begin their rounds, past the small stone angel that had stood at the garden's edge since before she was born. The angel's expression was as usual ambiguous could be. Wisdom could be amusement. It had never been possible to tell, and this morning it seemed more than usually knowing. She knocked. Pause. The small sounds of a cottage coming to meet the day. A shuffled step. The clearing of a throat. The familiar, particular sound of this door's latch being lifted. Her grandmother came to the door in her mourning things, her gray shawl, her soft shoes, her hair still in its nighttime braid. Face, the face of someone who has been many places and survived them all and finds the world, on balance, more interesting than not. She was the kind of person whose face at rest looks like a landscape, not still exactly, but settled, the way land settles after long rain, finding its final comfortable shapes. She looked at Clara, not at her clothes or her basket or the road dust on her boots, at her face, and then at something below her face, something in the quality of the air around her. It's the way certain people look at someone who has been somewhere and come back changed in a way that matters. The grandmother's expression did not change exactly, but something in it deepened, the way a river deepens when it reaches the part of its channel carved by time into the softest stone. Recognition, satisfaction, the specific satisfaction of someone who already knew this would happen and is pleased to find that it did. She opened the door wide and stepped back, and the warmth of the cottage reached out to meet Clara on the threshold. The smell of chamomile tea, already brewing, and beeswax and wood smoke, and the particular smell of an old house that has been comfortable for a very long time, that has had fires in it, and bread in it, and voices in it, and all the usual beautiful abundance of an inhabited life. Clara came inside. She set the basket on the table, the bread, somewhat battered, but intact, the butter, the honey, the green book, placed with a care that was not quite reverence, but was adjacent to it, the small dark lantern, set on the windowsill where the morning sun could reach it, its glass clean and its wick still faintly warm, resting now as the laborer rests when the labor is finished and the rest is well earned. Her grandmother moved to the fire and poured the tea and brought the cups to the table and sat down across from her granddaughter, and wrapped her hands around her cup the way you wrap your hands around something warm when you have been cold. It's not because you are cold now, but because the warmth is good and there is no reason to hold it at arm's length. She waited. Clara looked at the table, at the basket, at the lantern on the windowsill, at her grandmother's patient face. She thought about where to start. The thought itself was a small pleasure to have so much to start with, so many places where the story could begin. The forest at the edge of the village, the hum beneath the silence, the door, the color of the evening sky, the garden, the bench. The old woman who opened her eyes like shallow water over stones, the moonflowers, the basket, the lantern, the particular warmth of walking into the dark and finding it not dark at all, but full and inhabited and known. She began. She told it all, the moss, the door, the garden, the sleeping palace, and the boy with the extraordinary nose, and the prince, who had been sitting on a windowsill for 3 days, conducting an ethical inquiry with himself, and the princess, who had slept for 100 years and woken because a young man sat beside her bed and said the honest things, and the great gentle scholar of the forest library, and the old woman at the center of everything, and the river at the edge of the wood, and the morning on the other side. She told it carefully, with attention to the small things, the smell of the moonflowers, the warmth of the lantern, the quality of the silence at the center of the forest, the way the beast's enormous hand had held the green book as though it were a living thing, the specific settling of Philip's shoulders in the moment he found his answer, the way Aurora had touched every tree they passed, reclaiming the texture of the world after a century of sleeping. She told it the way you tell a story that you know is true and want the telling to honor the truth of it. Her grandmother listened without interrupting. This was one of her gifts, the kind of listening that is entirely present, that does not plan its response while the other person is still speaking, that receives each word as it arrives and makes room for it without hurrying on to the next. She had been listening to stories for a long time, and she knew that a story told with care deserves to be heard with the same. And as Clara told it, the green book sat on the table between them. Neither of them touched it, but its pages were filling as the story was told, not dramatically, not with visible movement, but in the way that a breath fogs a cold window, gradually, fully, leaving an impression. Outside, the village was going about its morning. The roosters had made their point and gone back to other concerns. The carts were out, the dogs were busy, the smoke from the inn rose straight up in the still air. The sun was doing what the sun does, brightening, warming, taking its time, making of the ordinary world a thing of considerable beauty. The kettle was refilled, the bread was sliced and buttered, and the honey was opened, and its amber light was returned to the morning air, and the grandmother and the granddaughter ate together at the old table in the warm kitchen, and the eating was its own kind of telling, its own kind of knowing each other. When Clara came to the end, the far bank, the road, the parting at the village fork, the gate, the flagstone path, the door, she went quiet. The story settled around them the way a fire settles in a hearth when the last log has been added, not diminishing, but finding its steady state, its long, comfortable burning. Her grandmother was quiet, too, for a long moment. She looked at the lantern on the windowsill, and her expression was the expression of someone who has visited that windowsill in her own memory. Not this literal windowsill, but its equivalent. The place in her own past where a lantern had been set down after its night's work was done. She looked at it with the distant intimacy of a returned traveler, recognizing a landmark from the other side. Then she looked at her granddaughter, who had gone into the forest and come back carrying her own light, would follow the sound instead of the path, would sit on the stone bench with an old woman who knew everyone who came through the door, and found, in the corner of the basket, a lantern that had always been hers. The grandmother's expression said, "Yes, precisely. That is how it is." She reached across the table and rested one hand on Clara's for a moment, one warm hand on one warm hand, the simple weight of it, and then withdrew it and picked up her cup and drank her tea and looked out the kitchen window at the garden in the morning sun. They sat in the warm kitchen in the morning light, and the tea cooled in their cups, and the lantern on the windowsill caught the sun and threw a small amber circle on the wall, warm and steady, a small familiar light. Outside the garden was full of dew and birds, and the clean, particular smell of a morning after a good night. And Clara felt the full, settled, particular peace of someone who has been somewhere real and returned to somewhere real and knows. Now, the difference between following a path and following a sound. She closed her eyes for a moment, just a moment. The forest hummed very distantly in the back of her mind, not a calling sound, not a beckoning, just the sound of something large and patient and still present. The sound of the oldest trees breathing, The sound of stories resting between their tellings, accumulating warmth, waiting for the next voice, the next ear, the next person who would hear the hum in the forest and understand it not as strangeness, but as invitation. She let out a slow breath, hens somewhere in the enchanted forest at the edge of every village. Hey, among the moonflowers and the ancient roots and the warm amber dark, a small light winked once and went still, waiting, as it always waited, for whoever came through the door next. For you, perhaps, the next time you close your eyes. The story is complete, dear listener. Let the words settle like leaves falling in still water, slowly, completely, finding their resting place. Let your body be heavy and warm. The forest is always there, the mossy path, the silver moonflowers, the door, the color of the evening sky. You can go there tonight, if you like. Just close your eyes a little more. Let your breathing slow. Let the humming in the distance grow softer and softer, closer and closer, until it is the sound of your own breath, and the sound of sleep, and the sound of an old story holding you gently in the good dark. Sleep now, sleep now.